We're finally here. After 4 games, complicated histories of development and narrative changes, legal troubles, and more, we find ourselves on the last entry of the Legacy of Kain series. The last real entry, because I don't think anyone considers Nosgoth, the failed multiplayer game, to be a real part of this world. This is Legacy of Kain Defiance, a game that was meant to push the story forward while resolving every plot hole and inconsistency created by prior entries, and ultimately would not entirely succeed in this endeavor. As always, this is a deep dive into elements of the Legacy of Kain series. There will be spoilers. Soul Reaver and Blood Omen, at least in terms of crystal dynamics, were meant to be 2 different but parallel series. One with Raziel as the main protagonist and the other with Kain, one in the future and the other in the past. If you think about it, such a plan would require a great deal of collaboration between the teams for both series to ensure consistency. In essence, having a unified vision for the world and all the twists and turns. But Crystal Dynamics chose the opposite, and as I mentioned in other retrospectives, the team behind Blood Omen 2 was completely separate from the Soul Reaver team, which was led by Amy Hennig, who had become something of a lore keeper for the series. Not only that, but aside from aligning on art assets and visual design of certain elements, most likely the Hilden, the 2 teams did not collaborate at all. Not to mention that the inconsistencies brought into the mythos by Blood Omen 2 created extra work for Soul Reaver 2. In the end, the lack of collaboration proved to be detrimental to both Blood Omen 2 and Soul Reaver 2, and the plan to have both series separate was considered pretty much a failure. Thus, the game that began its life as Soul Reaver 3 would very early in pre-production be renamed to Legacy of Kain Defiance, meant to bring both separate lines back together, and this wasn't just from the point of view of lore and the games, but also in terms of company restructuring, with a team behind Defiance comprised of members of both the Soul Reaver and Blood Omen teams. Defiance had 3 major goals. The first one to resolve any and all inconsistencies remaining with the plot, particularly the ones introduced by Blood Omen 2, such as Janos and Vordor being alive in Blood Omen 2. The second was to reinvigorate the series and help it appeal to a wider audience, which is why the shift was made for its action to be closer to Devil May Cry, a spectacle fighter. If there's one thing that was consistent about the previous entries in the series, that the combat is not very good, so they sought to change that. In an interview, Amy Hennig mentioned the plan was for the combat to feel more epic and heroic, with Raziel and Kain now being able to deal with groups of enemies which all act in concert thanks to the group AI the team had developed. Another major goal was to make the narrative more accessible, Hennig described as being less wordy, less tell and more show. In other words, make the narrative more like a movie than a theater, and thus easier to engage with by both new and returning players. We can see Defiance and this approach as the basis for Naughty Dog's Uncharted series, which has a cinematic feel to it from the beginning, and it's very much an Amy Hennig game. Speaking of cinematic, the camera was the next point, changed to feel more cinematic. The camera would shift to the best possible angle to make the scene look the best way possible. The change in camera was also, according to Hennig, because most games use the same styles of cameras, and thus at some point, they all start to feel the same. Which is not untrue. Take Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder camera for example. When first used, it was revolutionary and made RE4 stand out from other games in the genre, until it was copied so much that even its remake just feels like another game in the same style. So revamping Defiance's camera to enforce the new cinematic approach makes a great deal of sense. It's only unfortunate that the camera is awful in Defiance. So good idea, bad implementation is the only thing I can say. Legacy of Kain Defiance brought back the entire voice cast from Soul Reaver 2 and brought in Alistair Duncan to play the part of Mortanius, simply because the late great Tony Jay was already playing the Elder God. Curiously, the only character from Blood Omen that would have an impact on Defiance's story did not have his own voice actor. Hashak Geek, aka the Unspoken, aka the Seraphim Lord in Blood Omen 2, is voiced by the actor of whichever body he's possessing, either Duncan or Aubergenois. Carol Wolf, who worked on the script for Blood Omen 2, was brought back to help write the script for Defiance, though she stated in an interview with the Ancient's Den that Amy Hennig was the storyteller and the boss. Wolf would write the dialogue on a scene and send them to Hennig for approval, making adjustments and corrections based on what Amy Hennig said. Music-wise, Jim Hedges took the reins this time, and the soundtrack is primarily a collection of remixes from the tracks of previous titles in the series. Hedges worked on this title alone, as Kurt Harland was busy working on another Crystal Dynamics game called Whiplash. Much like every other game in the Soul Reaver line, Defiance would have to eventually cut plenty of elements from its end product. One of them being one of those key resolutions to plot holes that players were expecting. One thing mentioned by Carol Wolf as her major contribution to the game was reorganizing and rewriting scenes to account for all these cuts, so that the story and the narrative remained consistent. Defiance would also be the last mainline entry into the series for many reasons, but a key one among them was Amy Hennig's departure from Crystal Dynamics, followed by the departure of other key figures. And while there were other projects at one point or another under the Legacy of Kain banner, they would ultimately fail, and we are still left without a proper conclusion. Now, with all that said, let's take a look at how it all played out in Nosgoth and take a deeper look at the events of Legacy of Kain: Defiance. Defiance's intro is very much a remix of scenes from the opening cinematics of Soul Reaver and Soul Reaver 2, with Simon Templeman as Kain pondering on the journey so far. Given the choice, would you rule a failing empire or give fate a try for another throw of the dice? A better throw, and hopefully change destiny. And do we really have a choice? Kain realizes the only thing to be done is to try as much as possible to match fate move by move, very much like a game of chess, and hope to defy it. We then begin the game in earnest, and Kain is still in the past, 500 years prior to Blood Omen. Some indeterminate time having passed since the end of Soul Reaver 2 and Kain's choice that created such a massive paradox. The time itself was rewritten, and Kain gained a slew of new memories, particularly those of Blood Omen 2. Kain slips past the barrier and attacks a Seraphon guard, demanding information on Mobius, and then killing the poor schmuck to sate his hunger. And right here we see the first major change in Defiance. Many of Kain's abilities from prior titles have become context sensitive. If there are grates of any such flimsy barriers, Kain will turn to mist and go through them. If he needs to perform a long leap across a chasm, there is a circle on the ground that he uses to activate this ability. If it's required for him to fly somewhere, there's a bat symbol on the floor for him to activate his bat flight. It streamlines Kain's many abilities and keeps the controls simple. What is also instantly clear for the players that for all the talk about the best angle, the camera will be as much of a major boss in this game as the Elder God. It's truly awful. It's a hybrid of controlled camera and fixed point, allowing you to simply pan in different directions, but still having an anchor. It plays havoc with the platforming elements of Defiance. Kain explores the Seraphon Fortress, introducing the player to the combat system. Kain fights with the Reaver, not the Soul Reaver, but the original, blood-drinking blade, having prevented the event that would create its soul-stealing version. Kain can juggle opponents, use telekinesis aka TK to push enemies, hold them, throw them against environmental hazards, and a lot more as he unlocks new abilities by fighting. More interestingly, unlike previous entries, you don't need to stop fighting to feed. It can be done mid-fight. And you can feed Kain, or you can feed the weapon to raise its energy bar, allowing the use of super abilities when fully charged. It is worth mentioning though that the bar also fills just by fighting. Kain reaches a door, and though he's certain it will lead him to Mobius, it's protected by a strange energy barrier. One he discerns is connected to the Reaver. He figures some form of enchantment might be needed for the blade to break through this protection. Kain finds what he needs at a very familiar place, so much so that he doubts it's a coincidence. In the chapel, in the same alcove where one day William the Just will be entombed. Kain picks up the first fragment of the Balance Emblem, a relic attuned to the Reaver to enhance its power. After dispatching the combat tutorial guards, Kain finds another door with a strange barrier, and now with the empowered Reaver breaks through the seal and makes his way to that first door. That door leads to an underground passage where Kain sees Mobius communing with the Elder God, the time streamer telling his master that everything has been prepared and the stage is set, before beckoning Kain forward, fully aware that he's there. He attempts to be cordial since it's been quite some time since they last met, but Kain isn't interested and demands to know where Raziel is. Mobius' response is a callback to the start of Soul Reaver 2, where he tells Raziel, "When am I?" might be the more correct question.
Where am I? Is the usual question. In your case, when might be more apt.
He tells Kain that when is Raziel is what he should be asking, and comments on how Kain tried to add his own pawn and lost it, noting how humiliating it must be for Kain to come to Mobius to beg for information. Kain snaps at Mobius and attempts to make a move, only to be subdued without trouble by Mobius' staff, the Reaver dropping out of his hands. Mobius warns him not to threaten him, and then mocks him for falling to the power of the staff like any other vampire, as special as he may think he is. He berates Kain for his part in creating Raziel, telling him he has no idea what he created, what Raziel's true nature is, not to mention that his messianic delusions, his certainty that he's the Scion of Balance, a figure of vampire prophecy, have made him foolish and incapable of listening to advice. He tells Kain he'll have to find out for himself what the truth is. Then, kind of to add further insult, he kicks the Soul Reaver to him before leaving, telling Kain that he will recover his strength after Mobius leaves, but that he'll have other priorities to catching up with Mobius, and hopes Kain will learn some humility along the way. The door closes and it's decorated with a metal emblem that would fit another door Kain saw along the way. In that room where Raziel fights his human counterpart in Soul Reaver 2, and which one day would become the tomb of the Seraphim that Kain would raid to create his lieutenants. Defiance is great with all these callbacks. The pressing concerns that Mobius mentions are the new version of the elemental spirits first seen in Soul Reaver 2, now popping out of different shadows and swarming Kain. They're a very minor enemy in Defiance, more a nuisance than a danger. The advantage they have is that if you're struggling for health, there is nothing to feed on while fighting them. But more important than any other bit of combat is the Scion of Balance, Kain's ultimate goal, and though prior to Defiance we knew that Kain wanted to restore the pillars, to restore balance, and to bring the pillars back to vampire control, the term Scion of Balance and the fact that some form of prophesied figure is a new element to the mythos. Before Defiance, only Raziel seemed to be connected to some form of messianic figure in vampire lore, with Kain telling him that he's supposed to become the savior of Nosgoth. And what Raziel in turn asks Janos if he is indeed some kind of vampire messiah, Janos doesn't deny it. Even Vordor alludes to it, telling Raziel that the forges were only open to a specific figure in vampire mythology. The introduction of the Scion of Balance term serves two purposes. The first, it's something of a mission statement for Kain. After all, Kain's goal and the Science of Balance prophecy perfectly match up. And the second is that it elevates Kain now that he's back as a main character by putting him on the same footing as Raziel as icons of vampire mythology, around which there are conspiracies and manipulations. That was Kain's first chapter, so the second jumps to the spectral realm and 500 years in the future, to the time of Blood Omen, and we see Raziel has been languishing in the spectral realm for these centuries, refusing to serve his master, refusing to feed, and snapping back at the creature when it gives him the Wheel of Fate speech for probably the umpteenth time. Raziel says he refuses to do the creature's will, but much like Raziel called him out on just being another parasite, the Elder God returns the favor, making Raziel admit it's not a matter of will but fear that keeps him there, because he knows the end of Soul Reaver 2 was just a stay of execution. The moment he leaves, he exposes himself to the danger of becoming part of the Blade. Raziel realizes that whatever the danger, it's better to face his destiny head on, and so he pretends to submit, feeding a few times to please his master, the Elder God retracting some of its tentacles to open further parts of the underworld to him, putting the carrot in front of him, so to speak, so he learns that submission and obedience have their rewards. But Raziel's not an idiot, so the first chance he gets, he escapes from the underworld in a platforming race against a strange and deadly spectral mist, culminating the Elder God attempting to grasp Raziel with tentacles and only managing to bring down debris from a ruin closing off the entrance to the underworld. Raziel is in the lower levels of the mausoleum, and reaching its main hall, he finds a conduit, aka the swirly thing you stand on to return to the physical realm. But before he can use it, the Elder God removes it, telling him he's lost the right to use them for his Defiance. He's good with Raziel remaining a wraith, so no conduit needed. Seeking alternatives, Raziel faces through the metal bars on the window leading to the graveyard beyond. And though it will become apparent later, this is the graveyard where Blood Omen kicks off. Raziel sees a few floating souls and then ghastly figures appear, with scythe-like appendages and gaping maws for mouths. The Elder God's other servants, his hunters, were wayward souls. Seeing these creatures, he realizes he may become one of them if he doesn't escape, but his musings are interrupted as the hunters are there for him. He dispatches them and continues on, hoping to leave the spectral realm soon, before he becomes just another mindless hunter for his master. The closing of the conduits to the material realm ties into the new way you do it in Defiance, which was a change to give it more of a gruesome and scarier feel. But it also answers the question of whether those were natural or put in Raziel's way by his master. Not to mention that closing them means the Elder God is not a complete idiot, which is something you need to assert for your main villain to have any chance of being effective. And the Elder God's hunters are another callback, as they work exactly the same as the vampire wraiths did in Soul Reaver. Now we return to Kain, and he continues his pursuit of Mobius. His passage to the time streamer barred by a set of doors sealed using a statue of Malak the Paladin, its sword and shield missing. Though Kain is loath to restore his old enemy's dignity in this way, he finds and restores the items and continues on his merry way, finding another fragment of the balance emblem, this one empowering the Reaver with fire, and adding a similar elemental property to his TK, allowing him to light or put out flames at will. And again, it seems rather convenient, given that he needs this ability to raise some platforms to reach the place where Mobius awaits him. But this time, Kain doesn't question it. Mobius, as always, isn't surprised and gives a name to the artifact Kain has, which is, as I've said, the balance emblem, telling Kain it'll be used for him if he can find the other pieces, and beckons him closer to continue their conversation. Kain does, but this time on his terms, using his TK to remove the staff from Mobius' hands and bring him closer, choking him like he's Darth Vader. Mobius responds to the threat in the same way he did to Raziel in Soul Reaver 2, by exclaiming that this is not when or how he dies, so Kain can't kill him. But Kain retorts with, there are other fates other than death. After all, Kain got killed too and didn't die. He was made a vampire, so my guess is that this is what Kain is implying, turning Mobius into a vampire, which would be a nightmare for the time streamer. A cruel joke that Kain has already made in the past with Raziel and his compatriots. Mobius once again attempts to convince Kain that he's being foolish, that his vanity has blinded him to Raziel's true nature, and that his attempts at manipulating history are pathetic, that even saving Raziel from the Soul Reaver in Soul Reaver 2 has not done a damn thing to change Kain, Raziel's, or Nosgoth's fate. But Kain ignores the attempt at manipulating him, stating that with his action, Raziel retains his free will. He's still the wild card, and he knows it scares Mobius, because it means Raziel is invisible to him. Mobius admits it, but asks that he can see the ripples of Raziel's potential choices, and all of them end with Kain dying by Raziel's hand and him entering the sword. Kain is tired of talking with Mobius and demands to know where Raziel is, and Mobius tells him he's contained, too dangerous to be let out, but that in time he may be released. In particular, when it's time for him to enter the sword. But until then, he says, Raziel is simply too dangerous. Kain demands to know where Mobius' proof is, that Raziel is such a dangerous figure, and that Kain has misread him so completely. Mobius tells him to head to the pillars to find the testament etched in stone and teleports away, before Kain gets any more ideas on what to do with him. Kain says even stones can lie, but takes the hint and flies to the pillars, ending this chapter. Back in the graveyard, Raziel finds another mausoleum, and inside, a broken casket emitting some spectral vapors, and as he approaches, he feels the same pull as when he used the conduits. So he projects himself into the tomb and emerges in the physical realm possessing this long dead body, though he reshapes it to his form. This is a change to the shift that I mentioned before, to make it more dramatic and give it a more horrifying appearance. The only problem is that while shifts used to be a simple transition from spectral to material, now it has an associated time-consuming animation that does get old very fast. Sometimes simple is better than cinematic. The mausoleum has another hallway in it, but it's protected by animated raven heads that close the door as soon as Raziel approaches. So he has no choice but to leave the area, passing through a threshold outside that was open on the way in through the spectral realm, but closes as he passes now in the physical realm. This door, Raziel notes, is marked with the elemental power of darkness. Raziel walks into a camp of Mobius' vampire hunters, who are busy discussing the ghost huntings of the pillar, but pick up their arms as soon as they see the blue-skinned thing walking towards them, declaring it a demon and attacking. After dispatching them, Raziel continues his exploration of the area, and above him in an alcove, he sees a door marked with the elemental symbol of light. Not only that, but the door that will take him from this place to the pillars seems to have a lock that will react to both the light and dark elemental powers. Now, if you played Soul Reaver 2, you know that Raziel's Reaver was empowered with those two opposite elements, but the problem is, the forges he found were linked to elemental fonts spread around Nosgoth. They weren't permanent enhancements, much like the Fire Reaver required a burning flame in Soul Reaver 1. There was to be a cutscene or piece of dialogue in the game that explained that one of the Elder Gods' measures against Raziel was to destroy all those elemental fonts, and Raziel will be aware of the fact, prompting him to do as he does in Defiance, look for new forges, but that was cut. Raziel returns to the mausoleum atop the entrance to the underworld, and this time there's a nasty surprise waiting for him. A group of undead warriors rise around him, their eyes having a menacing green glow, and they whisper about him, calling him renegade, traitor, and asking what he is. Raziel doesn't know them, but realizes his own method of appearing in the physical realm was apparently not as original as he thought. These are the Hilden, possessing the bodies of corpses and coming to fight Raziel, to stop him from further altering the plans, knowing that he could change things in a way that doesn't play according to their design. This is, after all, the time period of Blood Omen, a critical point in time for the Hilden, specifically Ashagig's plans. An interesting detail is that in Defiance, souls were redesigned. Their look, instead of being balls of light, they are now humanoid in shape, upper bodies at the very least, and the Hilden have their own green souls with the little vestigial wing things on their back. A second interesting thing about the Hilden fight, especially those where exits are blocked until you defeat them, is that the green barriers have a symbol on them, and it's the one seen above the entrance to the device in Blood Omen 2. Raziel passes through this mausoleum to another open area with another bonfire and a new set of mercenaries, but on this one he finds another door like the one he saw before, similarly marked with the power of darkness, and this one has the crest of the element of light above it, perhaps signifying a ruin related to that element. Without the power of darkness though, Raziel is forced to continue, coming across more Hilden and other enemies, coming to that second level where he saw the alcove with a door decorated with a light symbol, which leads to another mausoleum. There are a lot of those in this graveyard. He makes it to an area very similar to the one holding the light element ruin, but the door found here has a dark element symbol above, and decorated with the Reaver, meaning this one might open to Raziel, and it does. Inside is a small room with a portal and a puzzle, and solving it activates the portal that leads to a section of the Vampire Citadel that will be seen in later chapters, this one acting as a forge for the element of darkness. The ruins are littered with murals depicting the history of the vampire race, this one showing the conflict between the vampires and the Hilden, the raising of the pillars, a vampire champion holding the Reaver, and lastly, the appointment of the Guardians. The images are meant to look like an ancient mural, partly faded, but in truth, they just look like really pixelated images. The texturing isn't the best, particularly in busy artwork like the one showing the war. Raziel finds the central chamber in the forge and uses it to imbue the Reaver with darkness, and unlike the previous forging he did in Soul Reaver and Soul Reaver 2, these power-ups are permanent, allowing Raziel to switch to a different Reaver on the fly. Not only that, but each Reaver element for both Kain and Raziel have both a spell, that ultimate attack you can unleash with it, and a super attack when the bar is full, though in most cases the super attack only means it deals more damage. Only a handful have specific properties. The spell for the darkness element renders Raziel invisible, so now Raziel can cross the threshold of that hallway with the Ravenheads, having found a way to remain undetected. And so he does, and makes it to a dank womb of darkness and decay.
I awoke to the pain of a new existence, in a dank womb of darkness and decay.
In other words, Kain's mausoleum, holding his casket and a huge portrait of the young noble from Corhagen. Though curiously, when shifted into the spectral realm, the portrait is different, showing Kain as a vampire instead, which is a wonderful addition. In this room is Kain's family emblem, required to open passage beyond this mausoleum and to the light element forge. Much like the darkness forge, it's another trip to the Vampire Citadel, this time the mural showing the moment the curse was inflicted upon the vampires by the Hilden, and showing that many vampires fell to despair and even took themselves out as a result. When Raziel imbues the blade with the power of light, we're introduced to one of the worst enemies ever included in a Legacy of Kain title, the statues. This first one looking like a weeping angel from Doctor Who, but with none of the charm. The statues don't flinch, have AoE abilities that knock you around the room, take just little damage from telekinesis but can be pushed or pulled, deal monumental amounts of damage, and have very deep health pools. In essence, they are indubitably and incredibly boring to fight. And this is the basic version of them. There are worse, but we'll get to those. The forges are unfortunately an element of Defiance that feels very much like they copied and pasted them over and over. In fact, the Dark Forge has rooms and even a climbable wall that have and lead to nothing interesting. No collectibles, no power-ups, nothing. Meaning it was likely a reused asset. You return to similar forges throughout the game, and though the exact details change, they are one aspect of the game that feels repetitive. There are exceptions, of course. Light and Dark are straightforward. Go in, get Reaver power, and the Spirit Forge is unique and quite engaging. But the other elements, air, fire, water, and earth, are functionally identical. The only interesting thing about them are the murals showing the history of the vampire race. And well, the first one of the elemental ones introduces a gimmick used by the rest that is fun at first, but not for long. But with both Light and Dark Reavers at his disposal, Raziel makes for that curious door with a double lock, and uses his newfound elemental powers to open the way to the pillars and have a quick chat with its tenant, Ariel. But before that, we return to Kain at the pillars at a simpler time, with Kain having a moment of contemplation and seeing the pillars so pure, long before corruption set in, before Ariel, before Nopraptor, and before his own choices. Tearing the pillars down, building the Empire on their ruin, and then starting this entire scheme. He wonders if it's still possible to save Nosgoth and restore the pillars with the right knowledge or plans. A rare moment of doubt for Kain, but ultimately a humanizing one. Kain's been at this for a long time and taken drastic and dangerous steps. It's natural that even he would have moments of uncertainty. The answers he seeks, according to Mobius, are close by, and after dispatching even more Sarafans standing in his way, he finds a monolith bearing an indentation for one of the fragments of the balance emblem, specifically one he doesn't yet possess, forcing him to turn back and look for it. And that leads me to one of my main issues with Defiance, that every time the characters need a new fragment of the emblem or a new elemental power for the Reaver, it's conveniently nearby or there is a door right there marked with the required elemental symbol. It gives the impression that these characters stumble upon these ancient powers in a purely coincidental manner instead of being an active pursuit. It's a minor issue, I admit it, but it makes the world feel small and it makes the characters feel as if they were on rails, which given the themes of the game, curiously makes it very thematically appropriate. But I do feel it hinders the world building and makes Nosgoth feel very small. The fact the game reuses many of its locations for both Kain and Raziel doesn't help matters. But Kain does find a new part for the emblem nearby, this one attuned to the dimension property of the pillars, and grants a super attack where Kain vanishes and teleports around, striking each enemy. With this new addition, he returns to the monolith and places a dimension fragment on it, making some distant mists part and revealing the Vampire Citadel, which requires a bat form launch point appearing nearby for Kain to make the trip. Kain flies away, and now our perspective shifts to the same map but 500 years in the future, as Raziel arrives and immediately finds his path barred by a lock requiring him to light some torches. So based on what I said above, you immediately know which door he's about to find nearby, requiring him to have an elemental ability he already possesses. But before heading into the Fire Forge, Raziel has to fight several of Mobius' hunters, and this time the entire set of mercenary variants are on call, and I do enjoy them. Each of them having their own little strategies to use, from the big guys you can't fight head on, to the really agile ones that throw bombs at you that you need to pursue, to the priestly ones that stay out of the way and buff the rest. The fact that different enemy types, being Hilden or mercenaries or Sarafan, all have different variants makes the combat work really well. What doesn't work, and happens in this level quite a lot, is that the circular barriers they create to force you to fight them stops your movement but not theirs, so you have to deal with hunters you need to kill to progress being out of reach, forcing you to depend on TK exclusively or wait for them to approach you. It can get infuriating, and it's a glaring design flaw. The Fire Forge shows a mural with the forging of the Reaver itself, and who would be on the mural hammering away but Vorador himself, looking much more human than he does by this time period. Raziel realizes the Elder Vampire may hold some clues, so he makes visiting Vorador his next priority once he's done with the pillars. This forge is very much about Vorador, showing that he didn't just forge the Reaver, but was the first human to be granted the Dark Gift by Janos Audron. And Raziel explains that the curse of the Hilden didn't just give the vampires bloodlust, but also sterilized the entire species. If you're just seeing this game on its own, then it may seem like Raziel is reading quite a lot from these images and making some wild leaps of logic. While the truth is, the dots are not that hard to connect. Janos tells Raziel that the pillars chose human guardians because vampires are no longer born. That must mean that at some point, infertility struck the entire species. From Vorador's existence, he knows that at some point, elder vampires began giving humans the Dark Gift, likely at the point where they could no longer conceive on their own. And in their history, from what Raziel learned, there was one monumental shift for them, and that was the Hilden's curse, which he knows gave the species their bloodlust, and he recently learned that many were driven to despair, so making the connection that the curse also made the species infertile is pretty logical. I mentioned before that the first Elemental Reaver forge introduces a gimmick, one that repeats for the rest of those forges. The gimmick is that these forges are inactive, and to activate them they must be infused with the souls of the vampire guardians entombed nearby. For this one, the souls require those of nature and conflict, the pillars with principles aligned to the element of fire. The Guardian of Nature fights summoning these vine-like tentacles from the ground and pushing you back after each combo. In fact, they all do this and it gets very annoying. And the Conflict Guardian goes one step further and summons minions to attack you. Up with the Guardians dealt, the forge is fully charged and Raziel obtains the Fire Reaver. He returns to the lock with the torches, gains access to the Pillars of Nosgoth, and the Spectre awaiting him there, Ariel. So far in the series, Raziel has interacted with Ariel about 1,000 years since she was bound in place, and about a century after the end of Blood Omen. But now he's interacting with her fresh from the grave, so to speak, still hopeful that Kain may fulfill the destiny they planned for him, and upon meeting Raziel, believes him to be one of the Unspoken, the Hilden, given his rather demonic appearance. It's clear to Raziel that all her hopes are on Kain, so he breaks the news to her that she doesn't know Kain and he will disappoint her. But at this point in time, she's not ready to believe him. She truly thinks that Kain will sacrifice himself, so she labels his words as poison. So Raziel simply asks for information on where to find Vorador, promising to leave Ariel in peace, and the Ghostly Guardian points him in the direction of the Black Forest, aka the Termagant Forest. What is fascinating though is that despite refusing to say the word Hilden, telling Raziel that the name will remain unspoken, as decreed by their ancestors, aka the ancient vampires, she shows complete disdain for Vorador and seems impressed by, maybe even content, with the effectiveness of Mobius's hunters, and wishes Raziel will go and decay with Vorador in that corner of the world. Worth reminding that in this moment, she thinks Raziel is Hilden, so she's putting Vorador on the same level as the Unspoken. Though it's not that surprising, the Circle of Nine has historically been very much anti-vampire. To proceed further, Raziel needs to acquire another elemental power, this time the power of air, so of course, this little patch near the pillars houses not only one elemental forge, but two of them. A little puzzle later, Raziel arrives to the Forge of Air, where the Guardians of Mind and Dimension await him, the former creating mirror images and the other teleporting around. The mural showed in this forge is a bit more critical to the overall story, even if it looks faded and some details are obscured, as it shows the prophesied vampire champion facing off against the Hilden's own chosen warrior, the vampire wielding the Reaver and the opponent a sword seemingly made of pure fire. Sound familiar? With the Reaver now empowered with air, Raziel finally leaves the pillars, using the Reaver's power to fly up to a previously unreachable area, and heads deeper into the forest to Vorador's manor, hoping the vampire might have answers to not just forestall but alter Raziel's fate of being consumed by the sword. It's time for Kain's next chapter, and he arrives in something of a meeting room at the top of the Citadel ruins, with exactly 9 chairs, likely a meeting room for the original vampire guardians of the Pillars of Nosgoth. Though Mobius sent Kain here to supposedly discover that Raziel is not what Kain believes or hopes him to be, Kain is thankful because this place may hold information on the Sign of Balance, which is what he's truly after. Kain finds a pair of murals depicting the conflict of the champions. Much like with Raziel, one of them is very much faded, while the other one shows the Hilden champion plunging the fire blade into the chosen vampire. The prophecy perhaps being that the vampire champion would lose. In this depiction of the two champions, he dubs one a redeemer and the other a destroyer. It sounds familiar because it's the words Mobius uses to refer to Raziel when they first meet.
Redeemer and destroyer, pawn and messiah.
This will be important later on. The ruins of the Citadel have multiple areas, but they're all locked behind doors bearing indentations for the Battleland's emblem, and he's missing a few of them. Not only that, but a human tribe seems to have turned this place into their home. And though this is pure conjecture on my part, I believe them to be the descendants of some of the humans brought to the Citadel to serve the vampires, or perhaps even be given the Dark Gift, who remained here after the uprising through which the human broke free of the vampire masters. Kain finds a crest bearing the Eye of the Elder God as a symbol, an item called the Wheel of Life, which is the first key he needs to open a passage to other areas of the Citadel and the next part of the Balance emblem. Much like Raziel, Kain takes a portal to one of the forges, the Light Forge, only he has no use for it. Instead, Kain jumps from one forge to the next using different gates. In this case, he goes from light to fire to the Forge of Water, where he unlocks a room holding the emblem part of the elemental power of lightning. When he arrives at the Fire Forge, he notes a pair of heavy-looking statues. Consider them the brutes of the statue enemy. He sees them immobile, but knows better than to assume they'll remain like that forever, something that will be immediately clear to the player as well. In fact, they light up when returning with a lightning-imbued Reaver, and if the smaller statues are a chore to fight, these are downright unbearable, and perhaps the worst designed enemy in the entire series. They have all the properties of the smaller variant, but also fire projectiles and can create a shield around its form that you have no choice but to wait out until it dissipates to get a few strikes in. It's horrendous design and the hardest enemies in the entire game. This chapter has an abrupt end. You find the elemental relic for lightning and return to the Citadel to open one of the doors that requires it. Kain comments on how a new area is open, and that's it. Back to Raziel and the longest chapter in the game. Raziel arrives to Vorador's lavish manor, and this is the first of the reproductions of a Blood Omen area in these games that I'm impressed by. Vorador's home in Defiance looks impressive as hell. After dispatching a pair of statues, Raziel goes into the house and immediately sees a statue of the host, the ancient vampire Vorador, and close by finds a stained glass window showing a vampire with the elemental symbol of water. And then Raziel finds himself in a small courtyard on the other side of the window, where he sees 3 gargoyle-shaped fountains pouring water into a pool with vampiric runes around it, with Raziel saying he thinks this pool is related to the portals he's been using to travel to the forges. Unfortunately, the water is turbulent thanks to the spouting of the fountains, so that's his next objective, to stop them. To do so, he must find 3 spears and drive them through the back of each gargoyle, at which point the water stops pouring from their mouths to the pools and blood falls from their chest down to special receptacles. To obtain each spear, Raziel explores different sections of the mansion, blocked off by Soul Reaver doors of different elements, though fortunately, Raziel already has all the required elemental powers. This is perhaps the only level where it's up to the player which spear they choose to pursue first, but ultimately they're hidden behind combat or puzzle challenges. For example, the one in the library requires Raziel to use the light weaver to illuminate some darkened bulbs, and the dining room the opposite. With all 3 spears piercing the gargoyles and the water now still, a portal forms there and Raziel jumps in, arriving to the same water forge that Kain visited in his previous chapter, and where the guardians of states and death await him. And the 2 final forges shake things up a bit, but not in a good way, by making you fight both guardians at the same time. And given that the Death Guardian summons a bunch of Spectral Realm scavengers, the end result is a chaotic mess of a boss fight. Nevertheless, with them destroyed, Raziel obtains the elemental power of water, which allows him to freeze water surfaces, especially waterfalls, which become surfaces Raziel can climb on. And of course, douse torches and other fires, an ability critical to open the path to Vorador, the door to his sanctuary requiring Raziel to douse certain lit torches. As for what Raziel finds in the ruins, it's a mural showing the 2 champions locked in battle, prompting Raziel to say, considering how much he looks like the champion of the Hilden, with glowing eyes and a fiery blade, that Mobius had been right all along, that he was going to fight Kain and either die by his hand or kill him. and he wonders what free will has to do with any of it. What indeed? Raziel meets Vordor for the first time in a long while. After all, their first meeting happened about 30 years prior, around the time Ariel was killed and the pillars became corrupted. If Vordor is surprised by Raziel's visit, he doesn't show it, and instead asks if the Wraith is here to join in the final struggle of the vampires, and wonders on which side. Raziel tells him he's not here to fight, that Vordor holds the answers he wants as the orchestrator of his fate. After all, he forged the Reaver, so surely he has to know what it was for. But the Elder Vampire doesn't know. He forged it, yes, but the only thing he knows of its intended purpose are bits and pieces of prophecies that Janos shared with him. Raziel asks if any of those scraps mention why the sword would imprison their savior, which Vordor takes as Raziel having made a choice on which path to follow or which side to stand with. But Raziel tells him he's not chosen anything, but instead he's been led, lied, and manipulated over and over. He wants Vordor to explain what Raziel's supposed role is, given that it seems he knows the truth. But to his disappointment, Vordor says he only thought he knew the answer, but now all the prophecies seem to have failed, with the pillars corrupted and Vordor the last of the vampires, so that when Mobius mercenaries finally end him, everything will have been a waste. And likely what Vordor means with the failing prophecies are those linked to the Sign of Balance. With the pillars corrupted, the prophecy indicates that the Scion will appear and restore balance and return the pillars to the vampires. But as the last vampire, if he dies, it means the whole thing was wrong and his sacrifices were for nothing. Raziel reminds Vordor that Kain is out there, and showing some concern, which by the way is consistent with Vordor's interaction with Kain and Blood Omen, he says Kain seems to carry a burden far heavier than the fledgling vampire likely even realizes, and he would be right. He then makes it plain for Raziel he can't help him even if he wanted to. Yes, he forged the Reaver, but only because Janos told him to, and he has no idea what his maker and the other vampires put on the blade in terms of enchantments. Raziel tells Vordor that when he met Janos, the ancient vampire tried to give Raziel the sword, saying it was meant for him. But did he mean as a weapon or as a prison? Vordor, to Raziel's surprise, tells him he should maybe ask Janos directly, and shows Raziel the body of Janos Aldrin, still as fresh as it was 500 years prior when his heart was ripped from his body. Vordor explains that somewhere out there the heart is still beating, and thus Janos' body doesn't deteriorate. Raziel asks if Vordor has ever attempted to recover the heart, and Vordor explains he's tried many times, but he's been unsuccessful. Their enemies had it hidden very well, and that it was taken to Avernus Cathedral at some point, and then dubbed the Heart of Darkness. He tells Raziel he may be the only one who can actually find the heart, and gives him a key that will open the back door to the manor and the path to Avernus. I truly dislike this cutscene. As much as I could listen to Paul Lukather and Michael Bell wax poetic as Vordor and Raziel all day, this cutscene is a whole lot of nothing. We learn nothing new, and Vordor is infuriatingly vague. I get it, they're holding off the big revelations for now. But I once thought I did, but now the prophecies have failed, it's not really an answer. And everything else about Janos and the heart is very much old ground and merely there to get Raziel to Avernus, even though the lead on the heart's location is flimsy at best. It's not that Vordor says he senses the heart in Avernus, but it was taken there centuries before as a trophy. Anything could have happened to it in those centuries. Raziel goes to Vordor for answers and leaves with not even a tiny theory. It's fine if Vordor is wrong and tells us something incorrect. It's already established in the dialogue that anything he says is just a conjecture, but it could have been used to plant some seeds of truth for that final reveal. In essence, if you remove 75% of this cutscene, it has no impact on the game, so it's a waste of time. It's there to pad the runtime. As Raziel reaches the library, Vordor appears before him once more and tells him Avernus is in flames. So this is during or after Kain's visit to Avernus in Blood Omen. Vordor is afraid that with the fire, their hopes might be dashed, and tells Raziel he'll have to hurry, but to be careful, because an unspoken evil is in the cathedral, and Raziel will have to resist its influence if he's to succeed. Of course, he's referring to Hashak-Gik, which in Blood Omen you can find his altar in the depths of Avernus, making it the heart of the Hilden cult in Nosgoth. And so Raziel leaves the manor for Avernus Cathedral, and we return to Kain in the past. And this chapter doesn't waste any time, immediately sending Kain across another gate to yet another forge ruin. and in this one he finds a curious mural, showing how as the pillars began choosing humans to serve them as guardians, the vampires sometimes adopted, sometimes kidnapped these guardians and turned them into vampires to maintain control over the pillars. And the last panel is the most important of this tale. We know that eventually the humans rebelled and broke off from the vampires, but the mural shows the leaders of this rebellion, Mobius and Mortanius. Mobius is the easier one to recognize for the staff he holds, while Mortanius is shown here with the Defiance interpretation of his original look in Blood Omen, which we have yet to see at this point. Personally, I think the mural should have shown Mortanius in his Blood Omen look. It's a bit more crude, but also more easily recognized by players. Nevertheless, this revelation gives Kain a moment of clarity as he realizes why Mobius hates him so much. Kain is the first vampire guardian in a long time, and Mobius knows what that means, so he's desperate to derail that possibility, for that fate for Kain to become a reality. This set of ruins is by far the longest sequence Kain has in all of Defiance. Unfortunately, instead of showing unique settings, it's a complete rehash of every forge, including the Earth Forge, which Raziel has yet to visit, with Kain going through gate after gate and fighting the tribespeople and a whole heap of statues, all to reach the final chamber where the Time Emblem is waiting, thus completing the Balance Emblem and allowing access to the remaining parts of the Citadel. But as he approaches the final emblem, he finds the same murals he saw when he first arrived to the Citadel, only these are pristine and show the vampires had indeed prophesied a conflict between the Hilden and vampire champions, one armed with a flaming sword, the other with a reaver. Unfortunately, they have seen both outcomes as equally possible, one where the vampire is victorious and one where the other takes the victory. Kain alludes to Mobius concocting all this, but is unsure what exactly the Time Streamer is planning. Kain opens the final door and sees the mural showing the ancients falling into despair as they receive the curse, the Dark Gift. He interprets the mural as showing them falling into some form of spiritual purgatory, but wonders why this door was closed, coming to the conclusion that maybe they wanted to keep something trapped inside, and to prove him right, the Elder God speaks to Kain for the first time. And he does so with honeyed words, using all the right terms, calling Kain Scion of Balance and Savior of Nosgoth. He tells Kain he is the Oracle of the Ancients and he can help Kain. So of course, the vampire is distrustful. The Elder God tells him that Raziel has found Janos' body and is in Avernus looking for the heart, but there is still time for Kain to stop him. But Kain realizes, seeing the images of Avernus in flames, where in time Raziel really is. And he mentions this to the so-called Oracle, who, just to make things extra convenient and thus extra suspicious for Kain, offers him a portal that will transport Kain in time, giving the Elder God a measure of power and control over the natural forces of Nosgoth that he never had used before. It in fact flies in the face of the end of Soul Reaver, where the Elder God tells Raziel that by traveling in time, he'd be out of his reach. As it turns out, he not only has Mobius' time omniscience, but is also capable of manipulating time like his servant. Unless he's merely a conduit for the Time Streamer in this case, but it's not clearly stated, so I can't assume that's the correct answer. Kain makes it clear he doesn't trust the Oracle, but he also realizes he has no choice but to jump into the portal and attempt to reach Raziel. Kain emerges in the same room but in the future, and the Elder God attempts to do with Kain the same thing he did with Raziel many times in the past, encourage him to kill the other, inciting conflict between them, using Kain's knowledge of his own history as sufficient reason for Kain to stop Raziel, to prevent him from doing much harm. Kain says Raziel is not his enemy, and if we ignore the execution, the manipulation, and the antagonism between them in Soul Reaver 1, and focus just on the sequel, then yes, Kain is not Raziel's enemy. That doesn't mean the Wraith doesn't see things differently. Kain finds a vantage point as sees Avernus in flames, confirming once more that he's been brought to the correct time period by the Oracle. And if Raziel truly intends to revive Janos, Kain agrees he must be stopped. Thus he departs in bat form towards the cathedral and a confrontation with his former lieutenant. Avernus in Defiance was once supposed to be a sprawling level, but most of it was ultimately cut, leaving only the main chapel and the catacombs. Raziel arrives and sees a platform meant to be used with the Earth Reaver, the final element, and one Raziel doesn't yet possess, so of course the door to the forge is nearby and Raziel makes the crossing to the Earth Forge to face the Guardians of Time and Energy, and a bunch of robot statues. Well, here Raziel also finds the missing piece of his puzzle, He sees the same mural of the vampires falling into despair, but now there's an added element, a symbol, an eye in the center with lines spreading outwards like tentacles. A crest seen many times and which represents the Wheel of Fate. And he finally understands the true nature of the dark gift, the curse of the Hilden, to turn the vampires immortal, so they would be cast out from the Wheel of Fate they worshipped. It wasn't the bloodlust that made them seek their own end, but eternal life. He's shocked to discover such a wise race had been duped by the parasite he knew. And if there's one thing he was certain of, is that the Elder God was not really a god. He returns to the cathedral and, using the newfound power of the Reaver, gains access to an ancient forbidden tome that opens a gateway to the lower levels, the catacombs, and there finds the other side of the story, the bit the vampires didn't include in their telling, that they started the war, that the Hilden were simply against their god and refused to submit to the Wheel of Fate. And now Raziel could appreciate the poetry of the curse and that his appearance, so close to that of the Hilden, didn't seem so accidental now. Furthermore, he comes across another piece of art showing the Hilden champion, meant to deliver them from their vampire oppressors and their god, and bearing the flaming sword we've seen so far. It leaves Raziel more confused than ever, as he doesn't understand the game being played where every side wants to claim all the pieces as pawns. And here, at the worst of times, of course, the Elder God comes to twist things for Raziel, telling him this is his true nature. He's not the vampire champion, but the Hilden one. And that when Kain finds out, what does Raziel think he will do? I figure this is because the Elder God is uncertain that he managed to sow the seeds of discord in Kain. The vampire is simply too accustomed to manipulations, especially those delivered by disembodied voices. And he did hold firm on Raziel not being his enemy. So now he's trying the same with Raziel, perhaps to put him on a defensive so that he assumes that Kain is coming for him. Raziel makes it further down into the catacombs and finds the cult of Hashakik in the middle of mass, with Mortanius leading the worship of what seems to be a massive pit. Raziel attempts to get closer, wondering what it was they worshipped, but he makes the mistake of getting too close to the edge, and he's struck by some form of energy and dropped to the pit below. In here we find someone who's been missing from all the action so far, the last target of Raziel's revenge. If this were still Soul Reaver, Turel, only here very much deformed, like the other brethren, a changed maiden Defiance. As in Soul Reaver, he was meant to have a more humanoid appearance. Here he retains the long ears of the Turelim, while the rest of the body is very much bat-like, only without the wings. Turel, voiced by Greg Berger, says he can't smell the blood and calls out that the sacrifice is rejected and that they, possibly the cultists, will know his wrath. He approaches Raziel and recognizes the scent, saying that it was impossible since he fell. Of course, meaning when he and Dumas threw him into the Lake of the Dead on Kain's orders. Raziel promptly corrects him. He didn't fall, he was thrown in by his brothers. Turel says he heard what Raziel did to them, and now of course the Wraith had found him, which is more than enough clues for Raziel to put it together and realize he's talking to his little brother. Turel hears his own name and says that was his name then, and on Raziel's comment on his appearance, Turel admits he's changed. He's now closer to a god, greater than Raziel ever was and greater even than Kain, which we've heard before from another brother. Curiously, the other one responsible for throwing Raziel to his doom. Dumas states very much the same stuff, claiming to have gained enough power to surpass everyone else. Raziel asks if he's the being they worship here, and Turel utters the name he thinks is his, Hashakik. Raziel can't understand why he remains in the pit, but Turel snaps back, telling Raziel he can't get out, and at that point, he's possessed by the Hilden, who say Turel has served them well to control the flock of believers, but that his time is nearly done, and in fact, the prophesied hour is swiftly approaching, more than likely meaning that the binding is about to be broken when Kain makes his choice. And here they change their tune a bit, and beg Raziel to prevail as the vampire's champion is approaching, seemingly throwing their lot in with Raziel as their champion. Turel regains control of his body but loses all interest in continuing the conversation. He wants blood, he needs blood, and he thinks Raziel's is good enough. Worth mentioning that it's very apparent that Turel is blind, so he can't see Raziel's emaciated and very likely bloodless form. He's straight up just skin and bones. But Turel is desperate and has a feeling consuming Raziel will help him protect himself from the intrusive presence of the Hilden and attacks. This boss fight is phenomenal, given that it's a perfect hybrid of a throwback Soul Reaver puzzle boss fight combined with a more action-oriented combat style of Defiance. Raziel needs to use his improved mobility in this game to avoid Tyrell's charges and his projectiles and wait for a moment where the blind vampire creates sonic waves that resonate with the gongs placed along the walls, striking them to stun Tyrell, creating an opening to land attacks in a way reminiscent to the first phase of the Marcus fight in Blood Omen 2. Even as Tyrell dies, the Hildens still intrude upon his mind, demanding Raziel go and kill Kain and destroy the binding. Curious thing is that for all his boasting, when he's defeated and laying there close to death, he says, "Yes, now," to Raziel, and in unison with the Hilden voices, he says, "We shall all be free," which in a way might be that Tyrell welcomed death to finally be free of the Hilden. After all, the process of them taking over seemed incredibly painful for Raziel's brother, but that's just my theory. Consuming Tyrell's soul enhances Raziel's projectiles to full Kain-level telekinesis. So at this point, the characters are on equal footing in terms of power, ready for that fated confrontation. Raziel climbs out of the pit and approaches Mortanius. Raziel tries to explain he's not Hilden because everybody seems to think he is, but Mortanius completely disregards his words. Ashagik takes control and tells Raziel he's indeed late to the party, but it doesn't matter. With or without him, the binding will break. The Wraith addresses him by his usual name, the Unspoken, and considers the irony of the Hilden being in the heart of the circle. Ashagik says it's poetic justice to topple the pillars from within, and that soon they'll have their revenge. And then lets go, allows Mortanius to regain control, trying not to break him completely, as he's proven to be a good vessel up to that point. Raziel asks for the Heart of Darkness, and Mortanius once more tells him he's too late, that the heart has served its purpose. He used it to set prophecy in motion and create the Scion of Balance himself, who will restore the pillars and return them to vampire rule. He admits he and Mobius were wrong in toppling their former masters, that he was wrong to believe vampires were simply a plague they had to take care of. Raziel, of course, pieces together the heart is how Mortanius created Kain, but asks what Mortanius did with it afterwards, asking if he destroyed it, which is a profoundly dumb question to ask considering he knows the heart is intact, otherwise Janus' body would have decayed already. But Mortanius enlightens him further, telling him the heart will forever be out of their reach as long as Kain guards it with his life. So yes, the Heart of Darkness is in Kain. He has it with him at all times. Mortanius says this is his atonement, that Kain's creation will redeem him and all of Nosgoth. Compared to the scene with Vorador in the previous Raziel chapter, this is the complete opposite. This one actually has substance, and also remains consistent with the characterization of Mortanius in Blood Omen, the only member of the Circle actively pursuing balance and restoration, even to the cost of his own life. And now with the extended vampire mythos, it further distances Mortanius from Mobius. Mobius is driven by his allegiance to the Elder God and his hatred for the vampires and can't see another way. Mortanius, on the other hand, realized they screwed up and did his best to fix it all again. But it does beg a question. If even the Hilden see him as their chosen champion, why have all the Revenants been after him? The truth is, they don't see him as their savior. They already have their plan, and Raziel is a wild card. This is an attempt at manipulation, and one that does work, as is seen when Raziel returns to the main floor of the cathedral and comes face to face with Kain. If you pay close attention to Raziel, his eyes glow green with increasing intensity. Raziel, in this conflict, by his own admission afterwards, was influenced by the presence in Avernus. The words they speak to him when using Tyrell likely in the back of his mind, urging him to strike at Kain to make Raziel lose himself, and he does. But I'm slightly ahead of myself. The confrontation between Kain and Raziel doesn't kick off at once, it escalates, with Raziel ever more incapable of accepting Kain's words and his intent, finding fault and conspiracy no matter what the vampire says. And the best thing about these scenes between Kain and Raziel is the absolute lack of any other sound. In this pivotal moment, you only hear Kain and Raziel's voices, no music, no environmental tracks, nothing. Kain arrives to Avernus, and as he approaches the altar, Raziel appears and utters a single word, Kain. Raziel asks, why is this no surprise? A very common rhetorical question in their relationship, but one that in this case, Kain does answer, saying their fates are intertwined, never to be separate again, and at every important juncture, Raziel will find Kain there. Raziel then wonders about his free will and what part does it play if Kain and he are so linked, Kain says he still has it, and that's the point, why he's here to talk to him. But Raziel takes that as yet another attempt at manipulation, and here we see the first of that green glow in his eyes. Raziel snaps back, telling Kain that his fate was put in motion by Kain himself, and that his theoretical coin has landed and it's time to deal with it. Kain tells him the coin is still spinning, and for things to work out in a way that benefits them both, Janos needs to stay dead. Kain is speaking calmly, he's not demanding, he's trying to be reasonable, but Raziel is beyond reason at this moment. And in his response, we see it, he's not trying to understand what Kain means, which of course flies against Raziel's entire journey in Soul Reaver 2, which was always about finding out the truth. Instead, he just thinks this is another attempt at manipulation, so demands to know if Janos needs to stay dead just because Kain says so. Then is his free will just something to be used when Kain wants it? Kain attempts to warn Raziel again, telling him there's more going on that he knows. And before Kain can say anything more, Raziel interrupts him and says he agrees, and that Janos has the answers he seeks. Kain asks for Raziel's trust, telling him their goals for Nosgoth aligns. And proof number 2 that Raziel is being controlled in this moment. His reply is very much, and if I don't, what are you gonna do about it? And for everything that Kain is as a character, how cruel he can be, how secretive and cunning, he's also only ever been 100% honest with Raziel. At no point has he ever lied to him. Kain doesn't attempt to manipulate Raziel because he hates that kind of stuff, having been thoroughly manipulated in his own journey. So here, once again, Kain tells Raziel he's not his enemy. He's not here to threaten him. Raziel asks how that can be true when he's holding the Reaver, Raziel's prison. And Kain reminds him that he saved Raziel from that fate and has no intention of imprisoning him, and even goes so far as to put the Reaver away. Kain in this scene is doing his damnedest to build a bridge between him and his former lieutenant, or between the Elder God, Mobius, the Hilden, and his own questions about fate and the ambiguity of it all. Raziel is so turned and twisted around that he can't see it. So once again, he snaps back at Kain, claiming the vampire won't imprison him unless it suits his plans to do so. Kain, visibly losing his patience, tells the Wraith that sure, he has the Reaver, which is a danger to Raziel, but Kain himself is also at risk. After all, Raziel holds the Soul Reaver, the only weapon that can actually kill him, by virtue of taking his soul if he strikes him down with it, plus the whole fiery sword in the murals being a big clue. Raziel summons the Wraith Blade and adopts a combat stance. Raziel, with his own thoughts and ideas of what the prophecies mean, asks Kain if the vampire knows who they are destined to be. Kain says yes, he thinks he knows who's who in the conflict. So Raziel, incensed that Kain would still think he can use Raziel as a tool, tells him think again and lunges at the vampire, the green glow in his eyes now very strong. Kain tells Raziel to be careful with what he's doing. Raziel counters, asking what's the point? If they are who they're supposed to be, isn't this fight inevitable? Why not just do it? But Kain tells him he won't fight him, he's not his enemy. Raziel taunts Kain, saying, is that it then? I win because you won't fight? Then mocks Kain one last time, proclaiming that the mighty Kain, scion of balance and savior of Nosgoth, surrenders before the final battle begins, and goes for another attack, and this time, Kain has had enough. He catches Raziel, throws him at the altar, and draws the Reaver, agreeing to fight him, hoping whooping his butt will make him the reason. Raziel is pretty aggressive as a boss and uses all the attacks you can use with him, with the difference of only using the base Reaver and not any of the elemental ones. When the fight concludes, Kain tells Raziel to listen, that he needs to stop looking for a Heart of Darkness, that using it will have terrible consequences. Raziel has a moment of pause here, defeated and a bit deflated, but it wouldn't last long. But he realizes from Kain's words that Kain has no idea where the heart is. He never looked for it. Kain attempts to explain the way the world works, how everyone has a fate, bound by it. Raziel says yes, bound to the wheel of fate, a topic he knows much more about than Kain, and tells him accordingly. But Kain adds the next detail, that because of Raziel's rebirth, he's outside of the wheel, the only one to actually have free will, the ability to choose. And here Raziel goes off the deep end again, taking everything Kain told him and coming to the conclusion that Kain expects him to make that choice at his direction when it suits him. But no, he tells Kain his pawn is off the board now and his powers have grown enough to match his former masters, and that it's time to finish this, his eyes blazing with the same intensity as the Wraith Blade in his hands. Now it's Raziel versus Kain, and it's time to talk about the sound design for these fights, and two important things to discuss. The first is the music, and you have to applaud the inspired choices for the background music. When playing Kain, it's the main theme from Blood Omen 2, which is heavy on percussion and just matches the mood of a fight. When playing as Raziel, the theme is Ozar Midrashim, the main theme of Soul Reaver, a game that was all about Raziel hunting Kain to kill him. And not only that, but it's a theme so iconic for the Soul Reaver franchise that it more or less speaks of the entire journey so far. The second aspect of the sound design isn't as positive, and it's related to a specific audio track for each of the characters that doesn't match their characterization. Laughter. When fighting Raziel, he can be heard laughing maniacally. When fighting Kain, he can be heard chuckling. It doesn't work. Sure, you could explain Raziel's laughter as that being due to the external influence on him, but Kain doesn't want this fight. He wouldn't laugh at any point of it. So it makes no sense whatsoever, and at least in my case, killed the immersion factor. Raziel slashes at Kain, injuring him and sending him flying, then runs up to finish the job, only for the vampire to catch Raziel's sword arm, struggling to keep him at bay, when suddenly, the energy of the Wraith Blade courses through Kain's body and into the Reaver, which starts to consume Raziel once more. Raziel reaches for Kain, thinking this is on purpose, but Kain, panicking, tells him he's wrong, leaving himself open. So Raziel says Kain's favorite phrase, Vae Victis, and plunges his hand into Kain and rips the Heart of Darkness, and follows it up with a translation of the quote, "Woe to the conquered." Raziel, eyes burning with green flame, exclaims that he's found the Heart of Darkness and tells Kain to go to oblivion, sending him hurtling back through the air and through a portal that opens right behind him. The portal showing up is, on one hand, very convenient and coincidental, but also this is Avernus Cathedral, where Azeroth the Planer had spent time tearing down the barriers between worlds to summon her demons, and is the home of a Hasha geek cult. So it's not completely out of the realms of possibility that in this place, the walls between realms are weakened, and that the Hilden couldn't open a crack to take Kain into their world as soon as Raziel pushes him. With Kain banished, the Hilden influence dissipates from Raziel. He's done his job, and he realizes he's been used once more. The influence in Avernus feeding his anger, and though he'd been hunting Kain for so long, he didn't feel joy in this moment. He wonders if Kain truly meant to harm him, saying he can't be sure of that, and now he'd never know. Sorry, buddy, but with a cool head, it should be abundantly clear that the guy who did everything he could not to fight you and told you he didn't want to fight you and that he wasn't your enemy and that his goal was to find a destiny that worked for both of you and had once before saved your soul behind wasn't trying to hurt you. Should be freaking obvious. Now, Legacy of Kain Defiance was meant to fix plot holes, but ultimately wound up creating another one. When Raziel returns to Vordor's manor, the place is in shambles, and it's clear that Mobius' mob ransacked the place. Raziel only hopes that Janos has not been discovered, and here Mobius calls out to him and congratulates him on a job well done. Raziel asks after Vordor, wondering if he'd escaped, but Mobius dashes that hope, throwing the elder vampire's sword at his feet, but assures him it took some effort to subdue him, and soon he'll be dead. Raziel tells Mobius that he himself is heading to his demise, but Mobius is fine with it. After all, a servant of the one true God, the Elder God, has nothing to fear in death, and he's satisfied to have played a small part in all this, especially now that Kain is dead. He asks Raziel now which of the heroes he thought he was, vampire or the other, but then reveals to Raziel that to them it didn't make a difference as long as the end result was that Kain died. Raziel laments how once again it's all been orchestrated and wonders if he truly has free will, as Kain had said, and Mobius delights in telling him that yes, he does. And that's the best part of it, that they made the guy who actually had a choice do exactly what they wanted. So once again, he congratulates him and teleports away, saying he has an execution to attend to. Now, the plot hole here, the narrative abyss, is that when Raziel is meeting Mortanius, the Necromancer is summoning Kain back to the Pillars for the final confrontation of Blood Omen, which of course means that when Raziel reaches Avernus, Vordor was already dead, as was Mobius. Yet this scene clearly takes place before those events, and the Defiance team would go on and confirm that this scene is erroneously placed. And I think it's just something that got misplaced in that plot shuffle that occurred when stuff got cut. Raziel goes through the now ruined mansion, avoiding mercenaries and even the Hilden revenants. I wondered why the Hilden would still come after Raziel, and I realized the answer is the same as before. They can't trust he won't screw things up for them. And this is the time of the Binding's destruction. The endgame is a critical time to have a free-willed, strong-willed monstrosity running around. Eventually though, he reaches Janos Audrin's body and shoves the heart back into the chest, and nothing happens. Janos is still dead. Dreading that it had all been for nothing, Raziel puts his hand on the ancient vampire and feels a sudden pull as energy courses through his arm and into Janos, awakening him. The energy likely coming from the Wraithblade. Maybe Janos needed a bit of jolt of soul power to wake up, or maybe it's the connection between the Reaver and its guardian that did the trick. Janos' chest injury closes and he takes a deep, gasping breath, the first one in over 500 years. He looks at Raziel and remembers what happened before the Seraphim plucked his heart out, and Raziel tells him he's been dead for 500 years. Janos of course wants to know if Vorador is still around, and Raziel quite bluntly tells him he's also dead, that his bloodline is done, and that the age of the vampires is ending. And it seems that Raziel left his tact back in Avernus. Janos grieves for his child but realizes there is a pressing issue and approaches Raziel, attempting to put a hand on him, likely to teleport them both somewhere else, but the Wraith rebuffs him, telling Janos Raziel is not what he thinks he is, nor has he brought the Ancient back out of the goodness of his heart. He has questions and Janos has the answers. Janos attempts to reassure Raziel, telling him there are those who will try to deceive him, but that his presence, his coming, marks the restoration of the vampires. Raziel counters with a big question: why then would you create a weapon to imprison him? And Janos doesn't understand. He says that Raziel is ordained by destiny to wield the Soul Reaver, at which point Raziel drops a little bomb on Janos, manifesting the Wraithblade and saying that he does wield the Reaver, just not as Janos thought. Janos reels from the revelation, uttering Redeemer and Destroyer, almost in shock, and you can almost see his mind furiously at work. He wonders if he misread the signs and tells Raziel that his fate might be more complex than Janos could predict, and teleports him to the place that holds the answers that Raziel is looking for. It's a delightful little place we've explored ad nauseum at this point, the Vampire Citadel. Janos explains what the Citadel is, how it survived the war, and how from this room they saw the pillars raised and the first guardians appointed. Janos sees the pillar and is worried that the binding will fail, but Raziel points that the pillars are doomed. Janos drops a line here that is, I think, a callback to Kain's line in Soul Reaver: as long as a single one of us stands. Only Janos follows it up with, there is still hope, while Kain in his dialogue said, we are legion. Possibly the same meaning: as long as there is a single vampire around, the species can flourish, the dark gift can be passed. Janos tells Raziel the humans can't have the guardianship of the pillars, they're not competent enough for it. Raziel asks then why they allowed humans to be guardians, and I find this question strange. He already asked this of Janos in Soul Reaver 2, and he knows why, having studied all the murals throughout the game. The only reason for this question is to prompt Janos for the full lore dump on the player, and it's a clumsy execution. Janos thinks there isn't time for the full lore dump, but Raziel doesn't budge, telling Janos that he wants answers and that the world can burn for all he cares. So Janos gives the full rundown, how the curse infected them with bloodlust, but the real punishment was the immortality, which cut them from the wheel of fate, the cycle of death and rebirth, and turned them from the light of their god, their deity becoming silent. Many of the vampires couldn't live with this and chose oblivion, and yet, Raziel comments, they chose to pass on the curse, but Janos explains why. The binding is tied to vampires, meaning to sustain it, they have to keep their bloodlines going. And they did so by turning the new human guardians until they rebelled and refused the dark gift. Lastly, while a great deal of vampires took themselves out, Janos didn't, because gift or curse, if it means keeping the Hilden banished, he'll endure it. And Janos' entire speech just proves the depths of his zealotry. The Hilden were decreed enemies and then banished just because they didn't believe in the same faith. And Janos speaks with the certainty of a zealot that the Hilden must be kept away. Not only that, but he doesn't bat an eyelid to the fact that they forced innocent people to become vampires just to keep their bloodlines going, simply rationalizing it as a necessary evil for the binding to keep. We first see Janos as this benevolent figure, but this is Legacy of Kain. There is no one truly good here. And this is your confirmation of the darkness in Janos' Aldrin. The key of it all is how he refers to the humans, how he thinks of them as foolish for taking the pillars, and he's incapable of seeing the vampires' part in this, incapable of empathizing with the humans the vampires kept forcing to become like them. This speech also explains why the Hilden were able to get a foothold on Nosgoth once more. Without the vampire bloodlines and their guardianship, the binding degraded over time. Now, with all that said, are the Hilden the bad guys? Yes. They are driven by their desire for vengeance and will stop at nothing. They don't care about Nosgoth and they don't care about humans who have nothing to do with their conflict with the vampires. The Hilden consider everything fair game and are antagonists to one and all. Raziel wants to know what all of that has to do with him, and Janos tells him that Raziel is the most important figure in terms of their collective destiny. Not to mention they are on the threshold of a new eon. And this is definitely a callback to the very intro epigraph at the beginning of Blood Omen.
There is a magical operation of maximum importance. The initiation of a new aeon. When it becomes necessary to utter a word, the whole planet must be bathed in blood.
As I've said, Defiance is good with all the references. Janos directs Raziel to the innermost sanctum in the Citadel, telling him there he'll find a trial and likely the answers he seeks, but to be aware that if he fails, he won't be coming back. And before he departs, he gives Raziel a gold Ouroboros ring he wears around his neck, telling him it's the key to the sanctum. Raziel uses the Ouroboros key in that same inner chamber where Kain first spoke to the Elder God. Sorry, the Oracle of the Vampires, wink wink. The door opens the path to the Spirit Forge, the final forge in the game, and thankfully one that is both different and engaging, and along the way, showing some fun uses for the Elemental Reavers. The most important being the Earth Reaver allows Raziel to walk underwater, like the Iron Boots in Ocarina of Time. But activating the final forge, which has 6 different fonts of power that need to be activated, won't be easy. Not with the Elder God deciding to get his tentacles dirty and interfere. Raziel isn't surprised to see the Elder God here, and the creature boasts about being everywhere. He is, after all, the engine of life, the inexorable cycle of death and rebirth. And perhaps after hearing this same spiel for about 100 different times now, Raziel wonders if the vampires chose oblivion not because of immortality, but to stop hearing the Elder God altogether. And the eldritch creature does not like that comment, threatening Raziel, telling him not to lose his favor with his impertinent tone. But with that said, he is pleased that Raziel finally fulfilled his fate. But Raziel won't be cowed, so he asks his former master what is it that he's trying to destroy in this room. What is it about Raziel that makes the Elder God so afraid? The Elder God tells Raziel that his fate is irrelevant, it was Kain's fate that was important. As he says this, the camera pans and shows 3 murals. 2 of them familiar at this point, the one showing the 2 possible endings to the fights between the vampire and the Hilden champion, and the last one showing the Scion of Balance, wielding a reaver of both steel and fire. And so begins the final challenge. In the center of the room is a font of magical energy, which the Elder God wraps in his tentacles to keep away from Raziel. Not only that, but he uses his immense strength to pull this font down into the ground, forcing Raziel to jump down and strike the tentacles, making them recede. With the font of power free, the elemental ones light up, and Raziel goes to each of them and using their matching element, empowers them. After each font of power is enabled, the Elder God locks things up again, pulls the font further down, and you have to rinse and repeat, using different Reaver abilities to progress in this puzzle challenge. It's pretty cool, really, it's really fun. With the final font empowered, Raziel frees the central one last time, making the Elder God retreat, at least for now. In this place, in the center of the Spirit Forge, Ariel appears, looking unlike she's ever been seen in the Legacy of Kain series. Restored, her face whole, and her demeanor kind and warm. She's both Ariel and not Ariel, an amalgamation of every balanced guardian, all summoned to the Spirit Forge to purify the Reaver in spirit. Ariel asks Raziel to release her, to release them, that the blade can do that. And this is something of an alternate version of what was originally planned for Soul Reaver, where to defeat Kain, Raziel would have to consume Ariel's soul with a Wraith Blade to empower it. Only instead of striking her with a sword, he does something similar to what happened between him and Kain in Avernus. He takes her hand and the energy crosses through him, across his body, to the Wraith Blade. Before departing, Ariel commends Raziel for doing good work and wants one last thing from him, to reunite what was torn apart, so that the Scion of Balance has everything he needs for his actual endeavor. Raziel has obtained the Spirit Weaver, but he's still unsure to what Ariel meant or what Janos expected him to find in the Forge, so he returns to that meeting spot to speak with the ancient vampire, arriving at the critical moment when Kain refused the sacrifice and the pillars collapse, showing their destruction from a distance, with Janos telling Raziel to find the Scion of Balance seconds before the pillars shatter. And with the binding broken and his prior host Mortanius now dead, Janos is the next one to become a vessel for Hashak-Geek, setting the stage for Blood Omen 2, as the Unspoken would take his body until he could reclaim his own and use Janos to feed the mass. But this will be the work of centuries. For now, the Unspoken still has to face Raziel. He cordially greets Raziel, and much like Mobius did, he congratulates him for playing his part so perfectly, delighting in having both freedom and vengeance in equal measure. Janos attempts to fight back, to regain control, but it's useless. The Unspoken is stronger, though he likes that Janos is strong, seeing as he needs a more durable body for the next step in his plans. And willing or not, Raziel delivered everything into their hands. Raziel tells him it's too early to celebrate, but the Hilden explains how everything, from processing Mortanius to Ariel's murder, was perfectly orchestrated for this moment, where the binding fails. Not only that, but they needed a new vessel and Raziel provided. They needed the vampire's blood and Raziel brought them Janos Audron. And even better, he murdered the Scion of Balance. Janos makes one final attempt and pleads with Raziel to kill him, to stop the Hilden. But once more, he's unable to keep control for long. The Unspoken disparages Janos, calling him suicidal like the rest of his kind, and reminds Raziel that the hero does his job and then steps aside. But Raziel is not about to follow the Hilden's order and blocks his path, telling Hashak-Geek he's not leaving this place and he will kill Janos if he has to. Thus ensues the final boss fight for Raziel, fighting a possessed Janos Audron. Raziel is victorious, and the ancient vampire begs him to do it, but he can't bring himself to kill Janos, which is the opening the Unspoken needed to reclaim control of the body and then blasts Raziel to death, or to the point where he can't sustain his physical form, slipping into the spectral realm. And with no adversaries left, Hashak-Geek flies away. Raziel returns to the spirit realm, specifically the room of the Spirit Forge, trapped there, and his Wraith Blade too insubstantial to harm the Eldritch God, who taunts Raziel and tells him no matter how far he goes, he'll inevitably return to him. He tells him to surrender. Raziel refuses to be a prisoner, but the Elder God tells him he doesn't have a choice anymore. He's fulfilled his task and swept Kain from the board, so he has nothing left. Raziel says the Elder God is only doing this because Raziel has free will, but the creature snaps and tells him he has nothing. But as he can't die, he'll just have to spend an eternity with him. He then calls Mobius to his side. And we switch points of view to Kain once more, still alive, if heartless, in the demon realm. Amy Hennig explained that his guardianship and his nature's design of balance sustained him when Raziel pulled the heart out. Though I believe that's something of a flimsy explanation, a cop-out really, even though Janos himself was sustained by his guardianship. It's more likely, using in-universe logic, that the process by which Mortanius created Vampire used the heart as a catalyst, given that it's the heart of an ancient, a true vampire relic, but didn't need it to keep going. The heart did provide Kain with a great degree of resilience, keeping him alive through what would be most fatal injuries, as seen in Blood Omen 2 where he struck down, and instead of dying, merely fell into a coma for a couple of centuries. And if we go by the automatic uses of the Heart of Darkness in Blood Omen, keeping him alive throughout his quest in the first game. That's my explanation for it. Kain awakens in this other realm and immediately is taunted by the Hilden, who comment that his pretty appearance would be the first thing to go. And while Blood Omen 2 Kain is hot, I don't think anyone would call Soul Reaver Kain attractive. A funny detail of this scene is that they call it the Demon Realm, but it's really just Turel's Pit, with some distortion effects on top and cracks on the ground. Which, if we take it seriously, begs the question, is the demon realm a reflection of the physical world, meaning it has all the same locations but altered, like the Upside Down in Stranger Things, or the Other World in Silent Hill? Or is this just a simple case of asset recycling? Demons materialize but Kain dispatches them, and a new portal opens so Kain takes it back to Nosgoth, to Jor-El's pit to be precise. And on arrival, he feels the pull of destiny, something in his soul telling him to go to the Citadel. It's time for the Scion of Balance to do his duty. In a parallel to the end of Soul Reaver 2, it's now Kain who's hounded by demons as he attempts to leave the catacombs, heading for his destiny, much like they did with Raziel as he pursued the Seraphim 500 years prior. But he does reach the Citadel and, looking back at the pillars, realizes what point in history this is, the act that determined his path long ago. And it's now Kain's turn to give a bit of a recap of all of his actions and to wonder if it was all for nothing, especially if he misread the signs and just messed up his chances of changing destiny. Kain makes his way to the Spirit Forge and sees Mobius standing there, and he smiles a cruel smile and glides down to meet the revived Time Streamer, who is in the middle of giving his master a report, assuring him that the Hilden are but a minor concern. He's right, given in the grand scheme of things, they will fail and be banished again in Blood Omen 2 and prove to be nothing but a side plot, but I digress. Mobius says the Hilden will be dealt with, but it's all worth it for Kain's death. And at this point, the vampire reveals himself, telling him he's a bit premature in his report and wondering if there's a crack in that omniscience. Mobius frantically attempts to use the staff, but of course it doesn't work because Kain no longer has the Heart of Darkness. And if you go back to that first meeting in the game when Mobius uses the staff, it's Kain's chest that glows when he collapses to his knees. Kain continues to mock Mobius, telling him it's not just the omniscience that's slipping, but also his other powers, giving him a smile. Kain can't believe it, so Kain takes his hand and puts it against his chest. He can tell the lack of a heartbeat, telling him the part of him that the staff worked on isn't there anymore, joking that after all, Kain has always been considered heartless. He tells Mobius it's time, and the Time Streamer says for what? To kill me? Accusing Kain of solving everything with killing. But Kain tells him it's not a debate, because Mobius simply has nothing to offer Kain, who runs Mobius through with a Reaver, killing him for the second time in the same day. Think about it, 2 versions of Kain killed him back to back. There's some poetry in that. Before dying, Mobius says this isn't the end, that he serves a master who governs over life and death. Mobius manifests in the spectral realm and tells his master this is but a minor inconvenience. But before he can complete his request to be restored to life, he's run through again, but this time by Raziel and the Wraithblade, the purifying power of the sword revealing to Mobius the creature it truly served. And the Time Streamer reels in horror before Raziel releases him to the Wheel of Fate to feed his master. A great callback to Soul Reaver 2 in that scene, where Raziel wonders if Mobius would be such a faithful servant if he knew he was serving a giant squid.
And if I tell Mobius that he's worshipping a giant squid, do you think his faith will falter?
We now have our answer. The Elder God claims it's irrelevant, that Mobius was no longer useful, but Raziel realizes there's a change. They didn't predict that Kain would survive, and the Elder God doesn't have any way of killing Kain or Raziel. As a response, the Elder God makes the entire chamber shake, telling him that may be the truth, but he can still trap them here, to the point where they'll spend eternity buried and come to appreciate how oblivion can be a good thing. Essentially telling them they'll go mad for imprisonment and then beg for a death that will never come. And as far as villainous threats go, that's very damn effective. But Raziel has now pieced it all together, the Redeemer and Destroyer line he's heard from Mobius and Janos in separate occasions. Not only that, but he realizes Mobius had never seen the Elder God even after worshipping him for so long. And it was only due to the power of the purified Reaver that it happened. He realized the vampires didn't know what it is they worshipped, and everything that has ever happened in Nosgoth, all the conflict and suffering had but one goal: to feed the Elder God, keeping souls trapped in the endless cycle, always ignorant of the truth. He hears Ariel's words once more, to bring what was split together again, and his eyes linger on that combined Reaver in the central mural. Remembering Kain's words that the coin is still turning, and Ariel's voice in that reuniting what was split apart, will allow the Scion of Balance to do what he needs. He realizes there was never a chance to confront the Elder God or be free of him, because you can't fight what you can't see. And thus Raziel understands what it is he needs to do, what his role truly is in all of this, and instead of being forced into the blade, he makes the choice Kain couldn't: sacrifice, or the greater good. Mobius returns to life and Kain runs him through once more, only for the facade to fall away and reveal it's Raziel. Kain panics and attempts to pull the blade away, but Raziel stops him and tells him this is how it has to be. He has to bring the Reavers together to heal Kain's corruption, and he's not Kain's enemy. He is what he always was, his right hand and his sword, and he is now ready to face the true enemy of Nosgoth. And before we go any further, this sequence is outstanding, and what I like about it is that it shows that Kain truly cares for Raziel. He doesn't want him to end in the sword, trapped forever. He's been desperately looking for a solution in which both live and doesn't want this outcome. But Raziel made his choice. Now purified, Kain sees the Elder God and, much like Mobius, is horrified, though mostly by the thought that he condemned Raziel to this thing when he cast him into the abyss. And so the jig is up, and the Elder God speaks to Kain again, this time no trickery, no oracle, just one-to-one. And it's the Elder God, so of course he launches into the usual spiel of the Wheel of Fate thing. If the Elder God is anything, it's consistent. The Elder God keeps trying to bring the Citadel down, telling Kain that he and Raziel can go equally mad, buried under the rubble forever. Ponder for eternity how futile it's all been. And instead of intimidated, Kain is encouraged by the creature's words and actions, because he knows that the Elder God wouldn't be so desperate to do this if he wasn't afraid that Kain and the Soul Reaver could truly hurt him. And he proves so by hacking away the tentacles, calling it a false god. And so the final battle in Defiance ensues, with Kain telling the Elder God that this is the final turn of his wheel. And it's a fairly simple fight, but so satisfying to finally be able to kick the Elder God in the proverbial teeth. When the fight ends, the room is coming down, so Kain teleports to the entrance. The Elder God screams at Kain that he can't be killed. He is the engine of life, that the wheel will turn, and someday the vampires will finally be extinct, and then Kain's soul will finally be his. So Kain, as he's leaving, tells the Elder God that until that day, he best burrow deep. In the outro, Kain walks towards the ruined wall in the meeting room of the Citadel, looking out at the pillars, contemplating events, how the masks were done, the puppet strings were visible, as was the main manipulator of it all, and that the greatest gift that Raziel gave him, more powerful than the sword and more acute than the sight he granted him, was the first taste of hope. And that is the final title in the Legacy of Kain series. Ultimately, it would sell about as well as Soul Reaver 2 and Blood Omen 2, and be considered a failure by the publisher's standards. After this, Amy Hennig would leave Crystal Dynamics, and due to myriad circumstances, no further game would come. Though there were plans for a Legacy of Kain Dark Prophecy, aka Blood Omen 3, a direct sequel of Defiance. A game for which nothing was ever written, not even plot or characters. The only thing that remains are scraps of concept art and some vague descriptions by members of the team. The only real information available comes from Daniel Kabuko, who consulted on the project before its cancellation, and he mentions the game would have involved traveling to the Hilden Realm and exploring their society and the demons and such. Maybe even have another parallel story, on one hand the younger Blood Omen 2 era Kain and the Soul Reaver Kain, but it was cancelled within months of its announcement. And I find an entire game dedicated to the Hilden to be very curious. Defiance establishes the Elder God as the true antagonist, and Blood Omen 2 already dealt with the Hilden, meaning they are just secondary villains, or in Mobius' words, a minor inconvenience. So focusing on them seemed rather pointless in the overall narrative. The focus should have been on the journey of the Scion of Balance and his attempts to restore the pillars. And yes, there was Nosgoth, a multiplayer team versus team game, but as it doesn't pertain to the narrative of the series and it never made it to a full release, we can safely ignore it. And we can do the same with Legacy of Kain Dead Sun, which was cancelled and its multiplayer repurposed into Nosgoth. And with this, we end this look at Legacy of Kain. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of this wonderful yet flawed series. Will the story ever continue? If it does, I firmly believe it will need Amy Hennig to be, as Carol Wolf said, the storyteller, the boss. I don't think anyone else could land the story, but it could very well be that Hennig wants no part of it. I wouldn't be surprised. But again, that is all for the retrospective into the Legacy of Kain series. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.